So by now we've learned quite a bit about the cardiovascular system. We first spent time going over the blood that's contained within the cardiovascular system. Then we moved on to the heart and discussed how blood is pumped through the cardiovascular system. And this chapter has been solely based on the blood vessels, their anatomical structures, and their functions. We have learned thus far that the blood vessels make up a closed transport system. There is no opening in our cardiovascular system to allow things in and out. If things are going to make their way into the cardiovascular system, they have to do so through the capillaries. We've also spent a good deal of time differentiating between the systemic circulation and the pulmonary circulation. We discussed that quite a bit when we were going over the heart and learning about the two different sides of the heart and where their blood is going to go to when the ventricles contract. It is truly the systemic circulation that we've spent most of our time on understanding here with the cardiovascular system. But we also are aware that there is a pulmonary circulation that's quite a bit different than the systemic circulation. As discussed in the last chapter, the pulmonary circulation differs from the systemic circulation in that the pulmonary circulation does not serve the metabolic needs of the tissues. The primary goal of the pulmonary circulation is to reoxygenate blood, and that is different from the goal of the systemic circulation. You'll also remember the coronary circulation, which is a very unique set of vessels that branch out from the aorta, and they will supply the actual tissues of the myocardium, making up the walls of the heart. So it is from these various circulations that we can see that not every circulation in our body is going to fit within the same cookie-cutter portfolio. There are many different types of circulations in our bodies, and they will all work a little bit differently than each other. And that will be the primary focus of this lecture video. We're going to talk about the special circulations, individual different routes that will span the body and will serve different purposes as our systemic circulation. Again, when we think about the blood vessels, it's very common to view the systemic circulation as that is going to be the largest of all of our circulations. But without some of these other special circulations, the systemic circulation would not function nearly as well as it does. So one special circulation that we have discussed already is the coronary circulation. And this is the circulation that we can liken most back to the systemic circulation. The coronary circulation is very similar to the systemic circulation in that the coronary circulation also serves to meet the metabolic needs of tissues. Now, the coronary circulation is meeting the metabolic needs of different tissues than our systemic circulation, but since the right and left coronary artery come out of the aorta, we can really consider this as a unique branch of the systemic circulation altogether. Another special circulation that we have mentioned is the pulmonary circulation. We've spent quite a bit of time discussing how the pulmonary circulation's major goal is not to meet the metabolic needs of tissues. The primary purpose of the pulmonary circulation is to reoxygenate deoxygenated blood that is going back into the right side of the heart. There has to be a way that we can take oxygen and put it back onto our red blood cells so that the systemic circulation can serve its major role. And that is primarily facilitated by the pulmonary circulation. So blood is not going in this circulation to bring oxygen to the tissues. It is strictly going to get oxygen back so that when it gets back to the left side of the heart can facilitate the oxygen transport out to the tissues. We'll also find that the systemic circulation will actually send systemic vessels out to the lungs to actually supply the tissues that can be found in the lungs. So we can hopefully understand that the two sets of vessels that are coursing through the lungs will have different purposes. One set of vessels is functioning to bring oxygen to the tissues in the lungs so that we can continually facilitate the reoxygenation of blood, and the other set of vessels is actually where the oxygenation takes place. So these first two circulations are two that we should be fairly familiar with by now. However, there are two others that we have not mentioned up until now, and they are the hepatic portal circulation and the fetal circulation. Each of these two other circulations are also considered special circulatory routes because the blood that flows through them is quite different from our other circulations that we have seen. The hepatic portal circulation differs from the others in that it is actually made up of a series of two capillary beds and will be responsible for receiving the nutrients from the digestive system. Nutrients have to travel to the blood so that they can get to the liver for processing. So between the series of 2 capillary beds that we have, we'll find nutrients being absorbed into the blood vessels and being transported in the blood. The fetal circulation is our other special circulation, and this includes all of the cardiovascular differences that the fetus will have compared to the adult. Since the fetus's lungs and digestive organs are not functioning properly, the mother's circulation is primarily responsible for making sure that the baby's tissues remain perfused. And the implication of non-functional lungs in the fetus tells us that pumping blood through the right side of the heart is not a necessity. And it is for this very reason that the fetal circulation will have many different vascular shunts to provide a more necessary and direct flow of blood through the baby. So this is also a very unique circulation. Now we've already discussed the coronary circulation, so we won't be spending as much time on that one in this lecture video, but we are going to go ahead and get started with the hepatic portal circulation first. The hepatic portal circulation consists of many different vessels, but there are 4 in particular that I want you to be aware of. The major vessels that make up the hepatic portal circulation are the gastric vein, the splenic vein, the inferior mesenteric vein, as well as the superior mesenteric vein. It is these 4 veins that will feed and give rise to the hepatic portal vein. Now, a portal circulation refers to a set of multiple capillary beds that are connected by a singular vessel. So each of these organs will have their own capillary beds coursing through the tissues, and those are going to be a major branch from the systemic vessels. Those are going to be the capillaries where oxygen is going to diffuse into the tissues, and carbon dioxide is going to be picked up and put back into the blood. That's where the actual deoxygenation takes place. However, from this step, these organs specifically are pulling nutrients out of the digestive system and bringing those nutrients into the capillaries. And so it is from here that we need to take those nutrients back up to the liver for processing. So before this deoxygenated blood makes its way back up to the right atrium, we're actually going to have one other place that it's going to need to go through, and that is the liver. The hepatic portal vein will drain all of the blood from these digestive organs. This blood is now oxygen poor, but nutrient rich. And so the hepatic portal vein will take this blood up into the liver and take those nutrients into the liver sinusoids. Inside of the liver, we're going to pull those nutrients out and then send that bad blood back to the heart to be reoxygenated. This diagram is actually going to show us that the aorta is going to have branches that go over to the liver to actually supply the liver itself. However, blood is also going to make its way over in this direction to our digestive organs. Those digestive organs are going to need energy so that they can digest and absorb nutrients as well. And it is from these organs that will have this oxygen-poor, nutrient-rich blood that will need to pass through the liver before it makes its way back up to the right atrium. Now, the pulmonary circulation is one that we should be very familiar with. The pulmonary circulation arises from the right side of the heart, and its major goal is to reoxygenate blood. The right ventricle is going to pump blood into the pulmonary trunk, and the pulmonary trunk will then bifurcate into the right and left pulmonary arteries, which will feed the pulmonary capillaries that can be found in the lungs. The pulmonary capillaries will be very closely associated with little air sacs inside of the lungs known as alveoli. Alveoli sort of look like grapes on a vine. And when we inhale, the alveoli are going to inflate, and that oxygen that has been pulled into our lungs is going to diffuse into those very closely associated pulmonary capillaries. At the level of the pulmonary capillaries, oxygen will be diffusing into the capillaries and carbon dioxide will be diffusing out of the capillaries. And that oxygen going into the capillaries will then be picked up by red blood cells and transported back to the left side of the heart through the right and left pulmonary veins. These vessels will flow into the left atrium, which will eventually flow into the left ventricle, and then that left ventricle is going to pump to feed the entire systemic circulation with oxygenated blood. The last special circulation that we're going to spend time on is the fetal circulation. Now, this diagram might look a little bit confusing, so I'm actually going to go to this diagram instead. We're going to go over this diagram first, and we'll make our way back to that diagram after we've covered the material on this slide. So at face value, this diagram probably doesn't look much easier than the last one. But we're going to go over what we see on this diagram first and hopefully make some sense out of this fetal circulation. So what we have to keep in mind with this circulation in particular is that the baby's lungs are not functional. The baby is not going to be breathing air in and reoxygenating their own blood. It is the job of the mother to reoxygenate blood for the baby. So there are some very clear differences in the fetal circulation when we compare it to the adult circulation. However, most of what you see here on this slide is stuff that you already know, and that's what we're going to go over. I'm going to show you which parts of this diagram that you already know, and then we will make our way into the differences that we see with this circulation in particular. So we know that the inferior vena cava is going to flow into the right atrium. And the right atrium, through the tricuspid valve, will allow blood flow into the right ventricle. The right ventricle will pump into the pulmonary trunk, and that's going to allow blood to go through the pulmonary circulation. This is going to be through the lungs, the pulmonary veins, and back to the left atrium. Now, through the bicuspid valve, blood is going to flow from the left atrium into the left ventricle, and then from the left ventricle into the aorta and to our body's systemic circulation. And the systemic circulation refers to all of our blood vessels that will eventually link back up with the inferior vena cava. It's going to dump into the inferior vena cava and then repeat the entire cycle. So you can see that all of these pathways that I have traced in red is the adult circulation that we've already taken time to learn. So you actually know most of this diagram as it is. What we're going to see, though, is that there are individual extra structures with the fetal circulation that will allow for the shunting of blood, which is just another way to refer to shortcuts that blood takes to bypass areas that are not necessary in the fetal circulation. So I'm going to change my pen color to green to point out the new structures that we'll see here that make up this fetal circulation. So what we first need to understand is the mother's placenta is going to be supplying the baby with oxygenated blood and nutrients. Through the umbilical veins, which is the first structure that we see that is unique to this fetal circulation, it is through these umbilical veins that we take oxygenated blood to the fetus. Now, we've seen that veins take blood back to the heart. We want to keep in mind that the umbilical veins will take blood to the fetal heart. The umbilical arteries are going to take blood back to the mother. So the umbilical veins will course through the liver. However, there is an additional shunt that we see that allows this blood to enter directly into the inferior vena cava, and that is through the ductus venosus. This is a tube that connects the umbilical veins to the inferior vena cava. After birth, the ductus venosus will close and we won't have it anymore, so this is one of our unique fetal structures that we see. Now, from this point, the inferior vena cava is going to flow into the right atrium and into the right ventricle, and we're going to see this pathway taking blood through the right side of the heart and through the lungs. And it is true that some blood will go through the baby's lungs. However, no reoxygenation is going to be taking place there. So it's not really necessary that blood goes through the right side of the heart, and that's why we have these next two structures. The first of which is referred to as the foramen ovale. The foramen ovale is a tiny hole in the wall of the right atrium that allows blood to go directly from the right atrium into the left atrium. Through this structure alone, we can bypass the entire pulmonary circulation. So it's a much easier route for us to take through the foramen ovale, since it's going to directly take us into the left atrium, as opposed to pumping blood all the way throughout the baby's pulmonary circulation. So this will be the second structure we see that's helping to make this fetal circulation different from the adult circulation. Now, I mentioned very, very briefly a few lecture videos ago about a structure known as the ligamentum arteriosum that connects the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. That structure is the remnant of this next connection point known as the ductus arteriosus, It is this structure that provides a direct route from the pulmonary trunk into the aorta. And this also allows us to bypass the entire pulmonary circulation. As the heart is developing, these chambers are going to be getting formed. And so some blood is going to enter into the right ventricle, and some is going to go up to the pulmonary trunk. But fortunately, with this ductus arteriosus, this will allow for another quick shunt from the right side of the heart to the left side of the heart. Now, again, I'll just say once more that some blood is going to go through the pulmonary circulation. It's inevitable since it is also an open pathway. That being said, we want to keep in mind that with the fetal circulation, the pulmonary circulation specifically is not going to be functional. So at this point, we really only have three major differences. We have a ductus venosus that allows for a direct connection of the umbilical vein to the IVC. We have the foramen ovale that's going to allow for a direct connection between the right atrium and the left atrium. And we have the ductus arteriosus that's going to allow us to have a direct connection between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. And from this place, you can see that our systemic circulation will take blood back to the IVC as well. Now we have to keep in mind that the baby is not doing its own reoxygenation. That has to be through the mother, so we'll have the umbilical arteries to take this bad blood back out to the placenta to get reoxygenated. So hopefully you can see with the things that I've highlighted in green, those are the major differences with the fetal circulation. Everything in red is what we already know about the adult circulation. The fetal circulation is going to contain those same characteristics. However, for efficiency's sake, we're going to have these other structures, the ductus venosus, the foramen ovale, and the ductus arteriosus, that allow for shunting of blood from one chamber to another to ensure efficiency. So this slide has all of the same information that we saw on the last slide we went over. However, this slide is giving us a bit more of an accurate depiction of what these actual structures are going to look like. You can see that here's the placenta, and we have the umbilical cord, which is going to be made up of the umbilical arteries and the umbilical veins. The umbilical vein is going to carry oxygenated blood out to the fetus, and you can see that it's eventually going to go through this structure known as the ductus venosus. Very unique structure that connects the umbilical vein to our inferior vena cava. So it is this ductus venosus that is a unique fetal structure. You can see that labeled here. So that will be the first of our unique fetal structures. Now the inferior vena cava is going to take blood into the right atrium as we are used to seeing. However, this is where we're going to come in contact with our second structure, the foramen ovale. The foramen ovale connects the right atrium to the left atrium to allow for a direct shunting of blood from the right side to the left side so that we can bypass the pulmonary circulation. Now you can see with the arrows, some blood is going to make its way down into the right ventricle, and it is going to go up into the pulmonary trunk. The blood that takes this pathway will then have the opportunity to go through our third structure, the ductus arteriosus. This is a direct connection between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. So for the blood that did not take the first pathway out, it's going to take the second pathway to get to the left side of the heart. Now again, we could also say that blood is going to take that third pathway, which is going to enter into the pulmonary arteries, which will enter into that pulmonary circulation. However, that blood's just going to come right back to the left atrium, and that is the pathway that we see in the adult also. So any blood that takes this pathway is going to get pumped down to the left atrium and then up into the aorta, where it's going to meet with the blood that's coming from the ductus arteriosus. This blood is then going to make its way down the descending aorta and travel all the way to the iliac arteries, where we will find our umbilical arteries branching. You can see that these here are showing us the umbilical arteries. These are going to take deoxygenated blood back to the placenta so that the mother's circulation can reoxygenate it for the baby. So these are the major structures that we see. We have these three structures that are going to give us an immediate shunting of blood from one chamber to the next, and we also have the umbilical veins and the umbilical arteries that will feed the fetal circulation. Now the other thing about our fetal circulation that is very important to note are the embryological remnants of these structures in the adult. So we'll actually find in the adult's cardiovascular system, we can see the remnants of these embryological structures that were once facilitating the shunting of blood. You'll find here at the top, the ductus arteriosus becomes a structure known as the ligamentum arteriosum, and we will see that connecting the pulmonary trunk to the aorta. This is no longer open, this is not a functional tube any longer, but it is going to still be there as a remnant of our embryological development. The foramen ovale is going to manifest as the fossa ovalis, which is imposed in the wall of the right atrium, right where the right atrium used to have a connection with the left atrium. It's important that this structure does close at birth because we don't want deoxygenated blood making its way over to the left side when our own pulmonary circulation is now the only one that is bringing in oxygen to our body. And the ductus venosus becomes a ligament on the liver known as the ligamentum venosum. You can see that this will actually connect with the embryological remnant of the umbilical vein, which is the ligamentum teres. And this makes sense because the umbilical vein was once feeding into the ductus venosus. Now we have the ligamentum teres, which is just simply connected to the ligamentum venosum. And lastly, the umbilical arteries are going to become the medial umbilical ligaments. These, you can see, are attached up here at the umbilicus or the navel, where they used to bring blood back to the placenta. So each of these embryological remnants is going to sound very similar to the actual embryological structure that we saw in the fetal circulation. The ligamentum arteriosum is going to be coming from our ductus arteriosus, the foramen ovale is going to become the fossa ovalis, and the ligamentum venosum is going to come from our ductus venosus. So as we continue to see, as we age, the cardiovascular system is going to decrease in its efficiency. The elastic tissue in the aorta is naturally going to be lost, and that's going to lead to higher blood pressures because there will be less elastic tissue to deal with the pressures coming into the aorta. Our cardiac myocytes are going to decrease in their size, and that's going to lead to a loss in the strength of our cardiac muscle in general. The sympathetic nervous system is not going to be as efficient as it once was, and that's going to make it much more difficult for us to increase heart rate. But overall, we can see the general function of the cardiovascular system is extremely integral for the homeostasis of our entire body. Without the cardiovascular system, we don't have oxygen delivery to our tissues, and without oxygen delivery to our tissues, we don't have tissues. The cardiovascular system serves as a transport route for things to get around the body and to go different places. We've discussed many ways that the cardiovascular system relates to each of our other 10 body systems. Here with the digestive system, we're going to see that nutrients from the digestive system will be transported to the liver through that hepatic portal circulation. And it is the respiratory system that's going to work hand in hand with the cardiovascular system to make sure that oxygen is put back onto our red blood cells. Every single one of our systems is going to receive its necessities from the cardiovascular system, bringing good blood to that system. And it's also going to serve a major role in removing the wastes that come from our other systems as well. So we will continue to take our understanding of the cardiovascular system with us to the lymphatic system.